It's official. Russia's air defenses have failed. Recent months have seen an almost non-stop assault of Ukrainian drone and missile strikes, and these aren't just taking place in occupied territories or a few miles over the border. Ukraine is blowing up targets all over Russia on a near nightly basis. There's very little the Kremlin seems to be able to do about it. Why? Well, it all comes down to one fatal weakness that has left literally millions of square miles of Russian territory utterly exposed to Ukraine's attacks. Vladimir Putin and the rest of Russia's leadership group had never have imagined it would come to this. When the war began back in February 2022, the Kremlin was confident of a quick and relatively easy victory. Much of the rest of the world agreed, with even the most optimistic Western analysts predicting that Ukraine would struggle to put up much of a fight. Even in the best hypothetical scenarios, it was expected that Kyiv's forces might manage to dig in and defend their lines, holding off Russia's mighty war machine long enough to potentially negotiate some sort of peace deal. Almost nobody foresaw that 3 years into the invasion, Ukrainian forces would be routinely blowing up Russian pipelines, fuel depots, and oil refineries with expert accuracy and lethal efficiency. But Ukraine has wowed the world, defied the odds, and is now in the strongest position it has been in years. In 2025 alone, according to figures from the Ukrainian Security Service, SBU, Ukraine has carried out close to 160 successful strikes against Russian oil extraction and refining facilities. This was revealed by the SBU's head, Vasyl Malyuk, at a press briefing in Kyiv on October the 31st. Malyuk noted that 20 of those attacks had taken place in September and October alone, including strikes on 6 major oil refineries, 2 terminals, 3 fuel depots, and 9 pumping stations. These are legitimate military targets. Oil extraction and refining made up around 90% of Russia's defense budget. These are the dirty petro-rubles funding the war against us. As Malyuk notes, the likes of oil refineries and fuel depots are 100% fair and logical targets for Kyiv to aim at, as they play a huge role in keeping the Kremlin's war machine up and running and the country's economy afloat as well. It's only thanks to its massive oil industry that Russia has been able to fund the war as long as it has. So even though oil pipeline and pumping stations might not seem to be in the same class of targets as, say, bomb factories and airfields, they're arguably among the most valuable and vital pieces of military infrastructure that Russia has. And Ukraine is doing an extraordinary job in wiping them off the map. Dozens of these integral elements of Russia's fuel and oil industry have been blown to bits and set ablaze by Kyiv's tactical drone swarms and precision missiles. And the consequences have been catastrophic from Russia's point of view, with the country slipping into the grips of an unprecedented fuel crisis. As Malyuk notes, Russia's domestic fuel shortages have skyrocketed up to 20%, while 37% of its oil refining capacity has been slashed. Fuel deficits are being reported in no fewer than 50% of Russia's regions, and Moscow has been forced to take action, banning gasoline exports until at least the end of 2025. Hundreds of Russian gas stations have also been forced to cease operations due to the shortages, while others have imposed strict limits on how much gas and which varieties customers can purchase. Millions of Russian citizens are paying more for fuel than they have in years, and many are also struggling to find it in sufficient quantities, often forced to queue for hours on end just to fill up their vehicles so they can make the commute to work and back home each day. And the strikes show no signs of stopping anytime soon. Indeed, on the very same day that Malyuk spoke in Kyiv, reports emerged of yet another attack, this time targeting one of Russia's most important military fuel pipelines, situated in the Moscow region. The Ukrainian Main Directorate of Intelligence, GUR, shared a detailed report of this attack on Telegram. On October 31st, 2025, as a result of a special operation by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, a very important military facility of the aggressor state of Russia was disabled. The Koltsovoy oil pipeline, which provided the Russian occupation army with resources for waging a genocidal war against the Ukrainian people. The Koltsovoy or Ring pipeline stretches almost 250 miles, 400 kilometers in total. It's an invaluable lifeline for Russia's armed forces, delivering a constant and steady supply of fuel for the Russian war machine. At peak capacity, it can pump up to 3 million tons of jet fuel, 2.8 million tons of diesel, and 1.6 million tons of gasoline, all from major refineries dotted around big Russian cities. including Moscow, Nizhny Novgorod, and Ryazan. According to the GUR's report, all 3 major fuel lines of the system were wiped out near the Remensky Direct, just a short distance southeast of Moscow. The GUR also outlined another important fact about this attack. The anti-drone net and the protection of the enemy facility by paramilitary guards did not help. All 3 threats through which the aggressor transported gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel successfully and simultaneously exploded. The oil product pipeline was put out of action. As the agency notes, Russia reportedly had anti-drone defenses in place to protect the pipeline, along with paramilitary guards stationed in the area who were presumably tasked with scanning the skies and taking out any enemy drones headed their way. In short, the area at least had some degree of air defense capabilities. Yet they failed. And that has been a persistent recurring theme throughout the recent weeks and months in so many other reports of successful Ukrainian strikes on Russian infrastructure. Time and time again, Russia has set up defenses around its most important assets in a desperate attempt to keep them safe from Ukraine's drone and missile strikes. However, on an increasing number of occasions, those defenses have proven about as effective as blunt knives and dummy rounds. It's important to note as well that Ukraine isn't Russia. Russia regularly deploys gigantic, record-breaking swarms of drones over the border and into Ukraine's towns and cities. One attack in early September featured an estimated 805 drones in total, for example. The Kremlin's commanders don't shy away from launching enormous amounts of missiles at their enemy either, as many of the drone swarms are followed by at least a dozen missiles, if not more. Ukraine doesn't operate that way. It doesn't have the means or resources to deploy drones and other weapons in those kinds of quantities. Even its biggest and most iconic attack on Russian soil, Operation Spiderweb, which took place back in June, involved only 117 drones in total. So it's not the case that Ukraine is following Russia's playbook and attempting to overwhelm the enemy's air defenses with massive displays of force. Its attacks are far less intense as far as quantities are concerned, yet still consistently deal huge amounts of damage, leaving Russia with billions of dollars worth of broken, burning infrastructure. Somehow, even with smaller forces and limited resources, Ukraine's attacks are able to bypass the opposition's defensive systems, which have often been heralded by Putin and his Kremlin cronies as being among the best in the world. If that only happened every now and then, it could simply be put down to good fortune. But it happens all the time, all over Russia. Only days before the pipeline attack, for example, Ukrainian drones were seen in the skies above several Russian territories and major cities, including the capital, Moscow. While there were no reports of major damage in the Kremlin heartland, the very fact that Ukraine's drones even made it that far was staggering for several reasons. Firstly, Moscow is around 300 miles from the Ukrainian border, and it shouldn't theoretically be possible for normal drones to travel that far, across so much Russian land, without being spotted and taken out before they even get close to the capital. Secondly, as the richest, biggest, and by far most significant city in all of Russia, the home of the country's government and high society, Moscow should have some of the very best air defenses in the world. It should be capable of defending itself against even some of the best cruise and ballistic missiles, and should be able to make light work of a few dozen relatively cheap drones. Instead, a famous photo soon went viral after the incident, showing one of Russia's mobile air defense systems guarding the Kremlin. The team in question consisted of just 2 soldiers and a machine gun turret perched on the back of a simple pickup truck. In the background of the image, we see the famous walls of the Moscow Kremlin, the beating heart of Russia itself. It was a fascinating symbol of how far the country has fallen, as well as the perfect pictorial representation of the one fatal flaw in Russia's air defenses. There simply aren't enough of them in the places that matter the most. The country's commanders have dedicated the vast majority of their defensive assets to the occupied territories of Ukraine and border regions, leaving vast gaps and relatively defenseless areas deeper into its territory. As George Barros, the Russia Team and Geospatial Intelligence Joint Team Lead at the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, notes, once you get past that initial shell around the theatre in Ukraine, the rest of Russia has holes and vulnerabilities. Sasha Bruchman, a military analyst with the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, in London, agrees, adding that Ukrainian attacks have depleted Russia's supplies of air defense assets, putting the Kremlin in an increasingly weak and precarious position. Russia has lost many air defense systems over the past 2 years, so it is plausible that there are many holes in their coverage that make successful attacks possible. There are several possible factors behind Russia's inconsistent air defense coverage. The first, as Bruchman notes, is simply the fact that Ukraine has managed to destroy quite a lot of these systems since the war began, and especially through 2024 and 2025, during which time we have seen Ukraine master the art of drone warfare and conduct more frequent and devastating attacks on Russia's assets. Time and again, the Kremlin's so-called world-leading air defense systems like S-300s and S-400s and even the cutting-edge S-500 have been obliterated, along with powerful radar systems that feed data to those systems to help them identify and intercept incoming targets. Many of these systems cost literally millions of dollars to make, so when Ukraine manages to damage or destroy one, it's no easy feat for Russia to simply build a replacement. Especially at the moment, when the country's economy is in such a terrible state, the Kremlin has to use its funds with at least some degree of prudence, and has largely preferred to focus its efforts on constructing more drones, missiles, and other offensive equipment, to the obvious detriment of its defenses. The second reason behind Russia's current troubles is quite simple. Russia is gigantic. It's the largest country on Earth, spanning an astonishing 11 time zones and extending across more than 6.6 million square miles, 17 million square kilometers. It's divided into dozens of regions, republics, and territories, with hundreds of cities housing anywhere from tens of thousands of people to several million, and countless smaller towns, villages, and settlements. Even with its powerful pre-war economy and status as the second strongest military force in the world, according to the official global firepower rankings, Russia cannot possibly defend all of these locations and all of its people at the same time. Even small countries often have blind spots in their defenses, and it would take an incalculable quantity of defensive systems, radars, and interceptors to cover the whole of Russia's vast lands. It can only work with the limited number of assets at its disposal, and Ukraine is bringing that number down with its consistent precision strikes. Every time Russia loses a missile battery, radar station, or interceptor launch platform, it gets just that little bit weaker, and the gaps in its air defenses get that little bit wider, paving the way for even more Ukrainian attacks. Meanwhile, Russia is left scrambling to plug the gaps as best it can. That's how we end up with situations where pairs of soldiers with machine guns are being asked to guard Moscow's government buildings and most famous cultural landmarks, for example. It's also one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin recently signed new laws that will allow Russia to deploy its reservist forces to defend regional infrastructure against future drone attacks. The country is quite clearly in dire straits, relying not on high-end, state-of-the-art air defense systems and supersonic interceptor missiles to defend its territory, but groups of soldiers with Kalashnikov rifles to somehow keep its skies clear of enemy drones. The third and final reason behind Russia's increasingly weak and weedy air defense situation boils down to two simple words: arrogance and incompetence. From the moment this war began, Russia has displayed an astounding amount of both. Its arrogance was on display right from the early days of the invasion, when many of those first Russian troops who crossed the border were ordered to take parade uniforms with them as their commanders expected that they'd be marching through the streets of Kyiv in a matter of days. The incompetence, too, soon started to show. Like when Russia massively misused its air force, failing to attain aerial superiority over Ukraine despite having far more advanced aircraft and a significantly larger force, or when its fancy tanks started rolling over mines or being cornered in urban corridors by groups of civilians. Evidently, Russia thought it was far too strong to lose the war. It expected to roll right through any kind of defensive lines Ukraine might establish, raise the Russian flag over Kyiv, claim the Donbass and surrounding regions with minimal fuss, and celebrate a comprehensive, crushing victory over its opponent. It stands to reason, therefore, that the Kremlin's commanders probably weren't too concerned about the prospect of Ukrainian drone or missile attacks on their own territories. They likely never even conceived of such an idea, as it would have sounded utterly ludicrous to almost anyone at the time. So, rather than worrying about building up air defenses and perfectly positioning them across its various regions and republics, Russia focused almost exclusively on its offensive efforts, sending its tanks, armored vehicles, and mechanized brigades over the borders in a relentless, ruthless onslaught, pursuing only power and territory, never stopping to think or wonder what might happen if and when its opponent decided to fight back. Now it's paying the price. Ukraine knows all about the gaps in the Russian air defenses. It made or expanded many of them itself, and it exploits them on an increasingly regular basis. And while not every attack is an enormous success, some of them have left Russia with truly devastating levels of damage to deal with. Back in April, for example, a Ukrainian drone packed with explosives struck one of Russia's Shahed drone factories in the Republic of Tatarstan, situated over 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. Again, before the war began, the very thought of an enemy drone managing to travel so far into Russian territory and blow up a critical piece of its military infrastructure would have been unthinkable. Now, it's simply part of the new Russian reality, as the country's long-range radar coverage has become increasingly patchy and its ability to intercept even slow-moving targets like drones is embarrassingly limited. The situation in and around Moscow is slightly different, as Russia's commanders have at least orchestrated several layers of radar and missile systems in a ring around the country's capital, as confirmed by Alexei, a Ukrainian deputy commander in charge of air defense units guarding the northern side of Kyiv. There's a high concentration of Russian air defenses around Moscow. It's difficult for our drones to reach the city centre. Even so, the late October assault proved that at least some of Ukraine's drones can and do make it into Moscow's airspace. And beyond the capital, many of Russia's other big cities have far fewer defences, while its smaller towns and cities are almost helpless to withstand even a relatively small aerial assault. There's just one final obstacle facing Ukraine. In spite of all the gaps and fatal flaws in Russia's air defensive situation, Kyiv still lacks the full firepower it needs to exploit them all the way. There's no doubt that the Ukrainian armed forces have experienced enormous success with their drone and missile strikes so far, and they're constantly working on identifying new enemy assets to target and plan their next deep strike missions. They're also doing all they can to enhance their drone arsenal and bolster their missile systems, recently unveiling some exciting additions like the much-vaunted Long Neptune missile, as well as the Flamingo, with its massive range of up to 1,900 miles, 3,000 kilometers, and the Sapsan ballistic missile, the first of its kind to be made in Ukraine. Unfortunately, despite Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirming that these kinds of weapons have been tested and are due to enter serial production sometime soon, they're still not quite ready or available in sufficient quantities to really hit Russia where it hurts the most on a regular, recurring basis. Instead, if Ukraine really wants to deal the utmost damage to its enemy, it's going to need more assistance from its allies around the world. Fortunately, aid is on the way. More Storm Shadow missiles recently arrived in Kyiv from the United Kingdom, and Ukraine is pushing hard to get Germany to sign off on sending its long-range Taurus missiles to support the armed forces. It's also still in negotiations with the Trump administration in the US over the possibility of Tomahawk missiles or other long-range weaponry that would unlock a whole host of additional targets far and wide across Russia's regions. If and when Ukraine can get its hands on those kinds of missiles or make more of its own, there'll be no stopping it. Learn more about how Ukraine is turning the tide of the war in this video, which looks at how Putin experienced one of his worst ever months in October, with massive losses and only the most marginal gains on the ground. Or, for another example of a Ukrainian drone attack wreaking havoc on Russian infrastructure, watch this video, which looks at a recent precision strike at oil depots, fuel bases and trains across occupied Crimea. Make sure to subscribe to our trusted channel too for more breaking news, updates and in-depth assessments of how the Russia-Ukraine war is progressing and what might happen next.